Just as a note, we're going to be recording this training as well and figure out a way to get it either on the website or out to everybody. My name is Travis Klempen. I'm a proposal analyst in OCG with Allie, and we're going to get this started.
Awesome. Thank you, Travis. As Travis said, welcome to Understanding Funding Opportunity Announcements. My name is Allison, or Allie Fisher. I am a senior proposal analyst with the Office of Contracts and Grants. The main departments that I work with on campus are chemistry, biochemistry, and geography, and a smattering of other smaller departments on campus. I have been a proposal analyst for the past almost 6 years at this point, so I have seen a decent amount of funding opportunity announcements in all shapes and sizes. And I am really looking forward into diving into these with you and sharing some of our tips and tricks when it comes to searching through these.
All right, and as I said, my name is Travis Klempen. I've been with OCG since last May. I work primarily with computer science and mathematics departments, and I'm also on the series team. It's fun to recognize a lot of the names here. Even within the last almost year, seen a various number of FOAs and different variations on there. So I think we're both excited to get into this. So this is just an overview of what we're going to do. Hopefully we have most of the time to actually dive into an FOA and start to pull it apart.
And before we get into pulling it apart, our whole main objective of this presentation today is to avoid proposal nightmares. These are based on true stories. So Travis and I want to share with you guys some situations that have happened for us that could have been prevented had we been better at really sifting through that funding opportunity announcement. So an example for me is I was working with a student on an NIH F-Series fellowship, and we were working to get the proposal submitted. We submitted it on time. Everything was great. And then about a week later, I got a notice. It was just a simple letter from NIH telling me that the proposal had been withdrawn because we were missing a significant proposal document. Turns out that we had accidentally sent the proposal into the incorrect funding opportunity announcement number with NIH. So NIH thought we were missing a document, but we actually weren't. We just picked the wrong FOA number. Luckily, I was able to reach out to NIH and have them reassign to the correct FOA number. That usually doesn't happen, so we were very lucky in that case. But literally something just as simple as submitting to the correct FOA number can make or break proposal submission.
And similarly to that, last year, right at the end of one fiscal year, the beginning of the next fiscal year, we had been proposing or getting a proposal ready for submission under the FY19 without the FY20 in effect yet. But as we were preparing for submission, we set up the proposal for it and submitted under the FY19. Luckily, we did it in advance of the deadline. So for a moment, we were pretty proud of ourselves and thought we'd come in under the deadline, and had the sponsor reach back out to us and point out that the FY20 was in effect. So we were able to pull it. But then we had to quickly read through the FY20 to make sure that there were no major changes, no additional documents or adding documents that shouldn't be included. So we had to scramble kind of to get it in again under the deadline. But could have avoided that had we, like Allie said, spent a little bit extra time on the front end.
So moving forward and looking at the significance of funding opportunity announcements, we simply want to define what those are. And funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs, are simply a document that outlines sponsor expectations for proposals. So it's something that is setting the foundation and the guidelines for what we are planning to submit to. And we also want to call out that funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs, have a lot of different names. I'm not going to read all of these out loud to you right now. You can read them at your own time. But these are some great examples of other things that these are called, but they all basically mean the same thing. So again, we've already talked about FOAs. There can also be, it can be called request for proposal or an RFP, broad agency announcement, BAA, that is typical for DoD and DARPA proposals. It can be as simple as program description or PD, etc. So there's a lot of different names that all basically mean the same thing. And at OCG, we tend to call them FOAs, or funding opportunity announcements, regardless of what the sponsor calls it. Our favorite acronym is. And then we also wanted to point out the difference between a solicited FOA and an unsolicited FOA. So a solicited FOA is when the sponsor is expecting proposal submissions and has allocated funding to support said activities. Those are the direct solicitations that we are applying to. For example, an NIH parent announcement where they have a specific mission or directive that we are applying to for funding, and they have an allocated number of dollars associated with that funding. Unsolicited is any time a proposal is submitted in the hopes that the sponsor will consider it for an award, but it's not really as formal of a process typically. We see this a lot with industry proposals, for example. So let's say we have a PI on campus that wants to work with Ball Aerospace. Ball Aerospace isn't necessarily going to issue an RFP, a request for proposal, to us, but they do want to fund our research. So it's more so just done with emails back and forth versus, again, a formal submission process through a solicitation.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about what these things might be called. So what should we be looking for anytime we look at any sort of FOA or any sort of solicitation? One of the most important things, obviously, is knowing when to submit. When are they expecting somebody to submit? Oftentimes, we'll see a rolling deadline or a window of opportunity, but probably most often, we'll see a specific time on a specific day. A lot of times, that'll be listed as 5 p.m. local to the institution that's submitting, which is worth noting when we have PIs and different faculty in different time zones. It's always worth remembering which actual time zone applies. Sometimes it will be given in Eastern or Pacific based on where the sponsor is located. One thing worth noting here is often we'll see with NASA a 12 a.m. Eastern time deadline, which translates to 10 p.m. Mountain time, but that doesn't necessarily mean your PA is going to be hanging around until 10 p.m. to hit the submission button. Eligibility requirements, we want to make sure that the PI that CU Boulder are actually eligible to submit. There may be limited submissions either per institution or per PI and even co-PI on a certain number of proposals for the FOA. Also, we might see tenure track or kind of the opposite of that, an early career faculty being eligible. There may also be eligibility guidelines on collaborating institutions such as a PUI, a primarily undergrad institution, or citizenry requirements, especially with a lot of the DOD and DOE proposals. Also, some of the pre-proposal eligibility requirements. An FOA might specify that an FOA might specify that a letter of intent or a pre-proposal is required, or it might be recommended or suggested, which we'll get into a little bit later. Again, we just want to make sure we're eligible to apply for that. Also, the program description. This gets into a little bit of the science of what the PA is proposing, does it line up with what the FOA is proposing to fund. This is a lot more difficult for the PA to determine or suss out, and so this is where we really rely on the PI to know that their effort is aligning with what the science that the sponsor is funding. We have had proposals returned without review if they don't align with the sponsor guidelines or the sponsor objectives. And return without review is basically something we never want to see. Also, award and budgetary information. This can include anything project dates or duration, budget caps, budget requirements for certain mandatory items. Let's see. It might also include guidelines on cost share, whether it's prohibited, whether it's required, whether it's allowed or encouraged, as well as any unallowable costs, and any deviations from standard practice. One of those, for instance, is NSF almost never allows cost sharing, but in some of their FOAs they actually do, so it's worth looking for that. And then finally, proposal preparation and submission instructions. How is it actually getting from us to the sponsor? Is it going through grants.gov, Fastlane, research.gov? Is it via email? Are there any required registrations that we need to know about, hopefully ahead of the deadline, so that we can register and make sure everything is working? We also, if you have the slides, I think we have shared these slides, and we'll make these available. We have some links to sponsor-specific examples. We're not going to necessarily get into that right now, but this is just a resource if you haven't seen these, you can poke around and kind of scan some of these rather basic ones before we get into the more detailed one later.
All right, if you have attended presentations with me before, I can guarantee you have seen this image or this pyramid. It's one of my favorite images to use in research administration because I feel like it really demonstrates all of the components that go into proposal submission and everything that needs to be taken into consideration. Typically, I would ask the audience what they think this slide represents. I'm not going to do that here because of obvious reasons and all of us webinaring in instead. So instead, I'll just go ahead and talk through this image and kind of what we're looking at and how it applies to funding opportunity announcements. So you'll see at the base of this pyramid, we're taking a look at federal regulations. So this is based off of the Office of Management and Budget, CFR. So this is where we're getting our cost principles, and that is our foundation for proposal submission. So at that federal level, it's simply the federal guidelines that we need to abide by for proposal submission. And then we simply move up the pyramid. So then we have sponsor terms and conditions. These are typically written out by sponsors via their own guidebook. So for example, NSF has the PAPPG, NIH has their SF424, NASA has their own NASA guidebook, etc. These are typically the sponsor interpretations or implementations of those federal guidelines as listed in that CFR documentation. Then we move up to the award terms and conditions. Sometimes an award will be even more restrictive or have different terms and conditions compared to sponsor guidelines. So that's another place that we need to take a look at to see if there are any other restrictions to take into consideration. And then at the top of the pyramid is institutional policies. So here we are talking about CU Boulder in our case, and that is also taking into consideration all of our ways that we are interpreting or choosing to implement those federal regulations. Typically with this pyramid, as you go up higher and higher, things get more restrictive. So speaking to the fact that the award typically is more restrictive than sponsor guidelines, but not always. But it is important to note that the most restrictive situation will trump. So a great example of this is F&A, or facilities and administrative costs. So taking a look at this from a federal level, the OMB or the CFR does state that institutions of higher education, so CU Boulder, will use their negotiated rate agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services. So in our case, that is a 54% negotiated F&A rate. Now we're going to move up to the sponsor level. We're working with a foundation, let's say, and a part of their term and conditions, or simply just their guidelines, is that they have an F&A cap of 10% on total project costs. Here at CU Boulder, I hope all of you are aware, we wouldn't then just say, oh no, we can't submit, move on. We have policies in place in order to be able to actually still submit. So in that case, our institutional policy is to get an IDC addendum signed by the department chair. And essentially what the department chair is doing is signing off to the fact that they are okay with the department not receiving as much F&A as normal, considering the restriction on F&A. So that's a great example of kind of seeing this pyramid in practice. So obviously the sponsor term and condition of 10% F&A is going to trump, as that is the most restrictive, but we do have institutional policies in place in order to accept that.
All right. So this is not necessarily a hierarchy of language, but again, it is open to some interpretation. Personally, as PAs, we like to see if there's this kind of language in an FOA, we're going to default to following basically what the sponsor states. If they are requiring it, if they're saying we should be doing something or encouraging something, we're interpreting that as the sponsor is telling us as an institution and the PI as the one submitting that this is what they're expecting, this is what they're hoping to see. An example of this that we found is the template language provided by the NSF for letters of unfunded collaboration. Now, if you read the PAPPG, there's a short section and it says, this is the recommended language to use for those letters of unfunded collaboration. And we've seen some other variations that don't follow that. And our question usually to the PI is, why aren't we following this? Or, if the NSF is putting it in writing and giving us basically the language that they're expecting to see, why wouldn't we want to follow their expressed interest? Of course, it's worth noting PIs do have the final call on the submission. It's their submission. We are the ones signing off on it. So anything within the proposal itself is the PI's call. But we do have, and we do provide feedback to the PIs of what is required and what is recommended. There are a few things worth noting that can stop a proposal, a hard proposal stop. Some of these might be working with Office of Foreign Asset Control or OFAC countries like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, or the Crimea region. Any foreign military involvement, if this isn't disclosed up front and we can put our approvals process in action. If there's no current DEPA on file for the PI or the co-PIs, just a friendly community service reminder that it is that time of year that hopefully by now everybody has their 2020 DEPAs filed. Any cost share approvals that haven't gone through, especially as they get more complicated, those might take some extra time, so that could be a hard stop that we'd then run into against the deadline. Some sponsors are on a no-go list. One of the most prominent examples is the Chinese company Huawei. I just mentioned the deadline itself. After, especially in some of these submission portals, after that 5 p.m. deadline, it locks us out and we cannot actually physically electronically submit. So that's even beyond the PA's control. And then also it's worth noting that depending on how much time the OCG is given to perform the review before submission, we do reserve the right to withdraw after if we discover anything within the proposal that might put the university at risk. And we're not going to do that, willy-nilly. There's going to be some communication, but that's why we ask for that 5 business day deadline so that we have ample time, especially as we get into these more complex FOAs, to conduct some of these reviews.
So one of the most important things that we like to take a look at whenever we're unpacking a funding opportunity announcement are the budget guidelines. That's usually one of the first sections a proposal analyst will scroll to, as it can be one of the most important ones to really sift through. So in composing compliant budgets, we're going to look for the following. The first will be caps and limitations. So some example of these are going to be NSF's 2-month rule, and that is specified in NSF's PAPPG, but is not going to be called out in specific NSF funding opportunity announcements. So that's a guideline that needs to be in the back of your mind that applies to all NSF funding, but isn't necessarily going to be called out in each individual funding opportunity announcement. And then NIH, for example, has an executive level salary cap and postdoctoral caps based off of their level of experience that need to be taken into consideration when composing budgets. And also just thinking about overall budget caps. Typically, when we're applying to NSF or NIH, we're going to have a budget cap, whether that's $250,000 per year, et cetera, et cetera. We're usually working under some type of budget cap. And if the sponsor doesn't specify one, the PI usually has a good idea of the budget cap that they might have in mind. The next thing we really want to look for is going to be cost share requirements. Typically, especially when we're working with federal sponsors, cost share is not going to be allowed. However, if it is required, there will be specifications within the funding opportunity announcement itself. For example, I know ARPA-E typically requires cost share on 20% of total project costs. it's also important to note that it's really important to define what total project costs means, and that is typically detailed in the funding opportunity announcement. If cost share is not a stated requirement in the FOA and it isn't mentioned really at all, it is OCG's official recommendation to not include it for varying reasons. Another thing we really take a look at as proposal analysts is any required formatting and breakouts. This is going to be specific sponsor formats. So for example, if you're submitting to DOE, especially ARPA-E, more often than not, you're going to be required to submit an EERE 35, which is a specific Excel template that DOE has created. If any of you have had the pleasure of working with this, you know how tedious it is. It is about 12 tabs of an Excel document, again, created by DOE, and it can be a nightmare to fill out. They require breakdowns by hours and hourly rates, which is not how CU does budgeting, so it requires a lot of additional time and is something to take into consideration when a PI is applying to that particular funding opportunity announcement. And also in formatting and breakouts simply meaning how the sponsor wants to see the dollar amounts broken out. So some sponsors want to see costs broken out by task. They might want to see it broken out by government fiscal year versus the calendar year. They also might want to see monthly breakouts. So again, all of these things are important for us to note because obviously they're needed for proposal submission, but they're also telling us how much time we really need to spend before we can even get the proposal out the door. So for example, if I was just submitting to NSF and doing a standard 3-year, calendar year, whatever the PI picks, project period, that's pretty easy for me to do and I can turn that around rather quickly. However, if we're working with DoD and I'm asked to do not only that calendar year, but also task, government fiscal year, and monthly breakout, I need way more time in order to provide that to the PI. Another important category is required categories and line items. So again, this can be as simple as the funding opportunity announcement, just calling out the fact that the PI has to travel to a specific conference each year, or perhaps the PI needs to devote X amount of time to the project, etc. So these are just really any line items that the sponsor is expecting to see in the budget. And the last thing we want to take a look at is simply project periods. So again, these would be specific dates that the sponsor is looking for. They might give a specific start date, and obviously that's the start date we should be using. And the sponsor might also give specific proposal durations, whether that's 36 months or 5 years, or perhaps for some of the weirder ones, they can ask for some phases. So phase 1 could be 18 months, and then phase 2 is 18 months, and then phase 3 is 24 months, or something like that. So this is a great overview of all of the different types of budgeting guidelines that could be included in a solicitation. This is basically as complicated as it gets. Sometimes the FOA will simply not really have any budgetary restrictions, and then it's nice and easy. So what you're seeing here is basically as complicated as it can be.
All right, if you've attended a training with OCG recently, you probably have played Kahoot. We're gonna do a short quiz. We're gonna try it in webinar fashion. So bear with us here as we get into this. If you have a device that you can log in, a smartphone or something like that, the pin will come up here in a second. All right, so there's the pin. Like I said, we'll give you a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions, shoot us something in the chat. Let's see.
Hey, Travis, are you sharing your Kahoot screen?
I am. Should I stop sharing?
I personally am not seeing it. I don't know if anyone else can.
Okay, let's see. Let's try this. I know everybody loves the music. All right, can everybody see?
There it is.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody. All right. So there's the pin. We'll give everyone a minute or two to log in. Feel free to put a name, choose an emoji or a nickname, an alias. We're not going to be grading anybody, but just a quick refresher of some of what we covered and hopefully highlight have some fun here. Cool. Looks like people are joining. A nice dinosaur. We're seeing some real fun folks here.
And we promise it only shows the top 3 people. It won't display the losers. So it's totally okay if you don't get any of the answers right. It's just supposed to be fun.
Yeah. All right, maybe another 30 seconds or so for anyone to join. There we go. All right. Allie, are you ready?
I am.
Okay.
All right. A funding opportunity may also be called. Awesome. Okay, so the correct answer here is all of the above except ITIDP, which was made up by our lovely training coordinator, Nikki. So not to say that funding opportunity announcement, FOA, and broad agency announcement, BAA, aren't wrong, but those are both funding opportunities and certain acronyms that can be used to basically mean the same thing. All right, what types of budget guidelines should you look for in an FOA? Awesome. So the correct answer is all of the above. So this kind of goes back a couple slides when we were talking through the different circles of categories that we want to take a look at. Formatting and breakouts is important, so are project periods, so are caps and limitations. So all of the above is the correct answer. True or false? The solicitation does not allow tuition in the budget. Therefore, you should not add it to the budget. All right, so this was kind of a trick question. So I'm proud of you all for being split. Good job. I was being kind of mean in putting this in here, but this is really going back to that order of precedence pyramid and taking a look at that. So we really wanted to hit that point home. So in my experience as a PA, I would have answered this question as false. So even though it is true that, or I'm sorry, as true. Way to confuse everyone. So the sponsor has the most restrictive situation here, so their policy is going to trump. However, I understand why some of you added false, because it is CU Boulder policy that any graduate research assistant or GRA that is named on a sponsored project must receive tuition. That is the policy as mandated by the graduate school. So again, our policy to help us to comply when a sponsor does not allow for tuition is for us as proposal analysts to ask the PI upfront before proposal submission to let us know how tuition will be covered for that particular GRA. It can come from departmental funds, PI startup funds, whatever, but a part of that GRA's appointment at CU allows them for tuition as well if they're on a sponsored project. So we have to make sure that we have that that available to them. But again, basically both of these answers could be argued as true or correct, I guess. I hope that makes sense. The PI has the final say in adhering to proposal requirements and guidelines. True or false? Nice, we're split again. This was another trick question. I guess I was feeling a little spicy when we wrote out these gaming questions. So this is basically true and false. So the PI does have the final say in certain things. So let's say NSF, well, not let's say, so NSF has particular requirements with what needs to be included in the biographical sketch document, let's say. The PI cannot choose to simply not provide a biographical sketch document because that literally would make it impossible for the proposal analyst to submit, because NSF Fastlane and research.gov have checks in place and the submit button will not be available to us because that's a document that is required. However, within the biographical sketch document itself, the PI can be the one to ultimately choose whether they want to adhere to NSF guidelines or not. Obviously, the proposal analyst is going to recommend that the PI follows the exact template as provided by NSF, but if the PI doesn't want to do it after we have recommended it, that is completely on them and their call. All right, well done, LE. I don't know who that is, but congratulations. All right, thank you all for joining in our Kahoot game, and Travis is going to work on switching us back to our slide deck so we can keep going here.
All right. All right, should be able to keep this going. Okay, we're going to start looking at some actual FOAs here. We want to look at kind of what are the standard components of a proposal so that we can recognize deviations. So almost every proposal that we're going to submit is going to have some sort of technical aspect. What is the PI actually doing? This will be described in the statement of work, and those documents are going to be included in, like I said, almost every proposal. And there's also going to be a cost element to it. What's budgeted? How much are we asking for from the sponsor? We're going to almost definitely include a budget justification unless it's specifically not required. Oftentimes we might even come up with budget justification for internal purposes. So like I said, this is not a definitive list, but kind of a rough list of the standard components of almost every proposal.
So we just took a look at standard documents, so it's really important to be able to recognize what a non-standard proposal document is. We have a list of some of these up here for you. So some examples could be letters of collaboration or support, a data management plan. We have that starred because data management plans or DMPs are becoming more standard in today's day and age. For example, is always required for NSF proposal submissions. And then some other examples. One to call out that you will see later is a risk analysis and mitigation plan. I honestly have no idea what that means, but luckily the sponsor, if it is a required document, will usually list guidelines for what is expected to be in that document, so the PI has an idea of what type of information they need to include. Another thing that's pretty important to note here is that last one, reps, certs, and assurances. That's standing for representations, certifications, and assurances. Anytime a proposal analyst is signing off or submitting a proposal, we are signing off on standard reps and certs. And a great example of one of these would just be that CU Boulder is a drug-free workplace, something like that. Sometimes, however, sponsors will require non-standard reps and certs to be signed off on. A great example of this is the DD Form 2345, which is a military critical technical data agreement. We actually here at OCG happen to have one of those on file. However, I didn't know that until I came across it and had to do a little bit more digging to figure out what the heck that was. So again, anytime we're working with a sponsor that has these non-standard proposal documents, it really helps to give the PA enough time so we can do some of the research that might be required in order to supply all of the proposal documentation the sponsor is asking for.
All right, so different breeds of solicitations. Hopefully you remember earlier when Ali mentioned the program description. This is one that we really like to see because it's fairly straightforward. For proposals, reference the NSF proposal and award policies and procedures guide, the good old PAPPG. It's worth noting we're still under the PAPPG 2019 and that the 2020 will go into effect June 1st. So we've already been reviewing it. We've already been identifying differences between the 20 and the 19 and hopefully communicating that out to everybody. Again, we've got a link there in the bottom, so once you have access to the slides, you can actually explore this one a little bit more on your own.
So PAs, we love seeing anytime there's a PD announcement where we're submitting to NSF, because pretty much all it means is we're following standard NSF PAPPG guidelines, and there is nothing fancy or weird about it, and we know exactly what to look for and what to do. So these can be some of the easiest submissions for us. Moving on to a great example of another NSF solicitation that I would not define as easy is the NSF MRI, or Major Research Instrumentation Program. So this particular program solicitation is very different from standard NSF guidelines for a few reasons. We call out a few of these here for you. So one example is that there actually is a limit on the number of proposals per organization. So this is related to that PI eligibility that Travis was talking about earlier in our presentation. It's really important for us to call these things out when only a certain number of PIs can submit from our institution. I'm sure many of you are familiar with RIO, or the Research Innovation Office, and their limited competitions. So RIO runs limited competitions in order to select who from our institution will be able to apply to this. So there is a process for that. It's not necessarily a first come, first serve, but the PA, whenever we see a limited number of submissions, we need to make sure we have an email from RIO stating that our PI was selected to move forward with submission. And if we don't have that email, we need to backtrack and make sure that our PI is eligible on behalf of CU Boulder. And another thing to call out for the NSF MRI is that it actually requires cost share, which is very unique for NSF. Typically, NSF absolutely does not allow cost share whatsoever, but on this particular one, it's required. And as you can see in this table that popped up on the slide deck, NSF also expects to see this table replicated exactly in the budget justification. So the eligibility and the cost share components are just two examples of weird things that are in this solicitation, but there are actually a lot of other ones. And after our talk today, we will send you a PDF of this solicitation that Travis and I have highlighted, basically calling out everything that would be important to a proposal analyst. And everything we've highlighted is essentially everything that is non-standard or is a deviation from what we typically see when submitting to NSF.
All right, so unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you like group work, in person we would have handed out the DARPA solicitation. Instead, we're gonna try and go through it. I think it should have been included as an attachment on the invitation from Nikki, so if you do have it, feel free to follow along. And again, this will be made available to you after the training.
All right, so like Travis said, we would have loved for you to actually read through this solicitation. So you're aware the solicitation is about 65 pages long, which can feel really intimidating at first. No one wants to sit and read through 65 pages of really dull, dry, boring material. But luckily, as proposal analysts, again, we are trained to kind of know what we can skim and really what we need to start with. So for example, we're starting right here. The first thing you're seeing here, application and submission information, is not found until page 33 of that DARPA FOA. All pages before that, so pages 1 through 32, are literally just DARPA calling out its specific mission and the types of proposals that it's expecting to see. So not to say that that is just something that can be skipped and no one cares about. That actually is very important for the PI to pay attention to, because it's very important that the PI, whatever research they're proposing, actually relates to the program announcement they're applying to, but it doesn't really pertain to any information that the proposal analyst needs to know. So typically, whenever we're sifting through these documents, we're kind of looking for words like submission information or something like that. So the first thing that we have boxed is everything that is in all caps. So this is basically why we exist. The DARPA solicitation is telling us that if you aren't following these guidelines, there's a chance your proposal will be rejected and returned without review. So again, it's really important that we're paying attention to this. All right, and moving on. So we kind of just looked at the main application and submission guidelines, and then what DARPA is going to do is start to break things out for us. So this is another great example of something we've already talked about before. We're seeing there's an abstract versus a full proposal that is required for submission. So the abstract in this case is essentially an LOI, or a letter of intent. So DARPA states proposers are strongly encouraged to submit an abstract in advance of a full proposal. Again, we're seeing that word encouraged. To proposal analysts, we think if the sponsor is encouraging you to do it, you should do it, but it isn't a must. So if the PI chooses not to, that's perfectly okay, and we can submit a full application, but we would recommend that the PI submits an abstract. And it's important to call out that the abstract guidelines are different from the full proposal formatting guidelines. So depending on what we're submitting to, we would need to filter that information out as well. So let's say our PI has already submitted an abstract and has been recommended to move forward with a full proposal. Then we're taking a look at item 2, full proposal formatting. We highlighted pretty much all of this information is important, obviously, but we're highlighting the things that really speak out to us. So one of the main things is calling out that the technical and management proposal shall not exceed 30 pages. That's an important thing to note. And then we also see something that's kind of different and non-standard, is that a summary slide of the proposed effort in PowerPoint format should be submitted with the proposal. This is a pretty standard requirement coming from DARPA. They usually like to see PowerPoint slides.
All right, we really like to see information like this in an FOA. Cover sheet to include, and it's literally a numbered list of the exact order and the exact format that they want to see things in. I mean, just to take an example, point 8, technical point of contact to include, and then it breaks it down, as detailed as zip code +4, facts if available. That kind of information is very helpful to a PA. It's almost like a sponsor generated checklist that we can then review to make sure that the proposal is in line with their guidelines. And then we've boxed official transmittal letter down there in B. Now the OCG proposal analyst will create and sign this as the authorized representative, which is another key phrase that you can be looking for in any FOA is, when does OCG need to sign something and when is it not OCG's, under OCG's responsibility. A quick note, and one thing referencing back to the PDFs that we'll be providing afterwards, Control F, when reading an FOA for the first time, Control F should be your best friend looking for some of these key phrases.
All right, moving on, keeping in mind that DARPA is calling the different sections of the proposal Volume 1 and Volume 2. So we're still sitting in Volume 1, which is the technical and management proposal section of the proposal. And then Volume 2 is going to be the cost proposal. So pretty much Volume 1, we're talking about all other proposal documents, which is why this section is going to feel really long. So we talked about the cover sheet that is expected to be seen, and then we're seeing section 2, which is detailed proposal information. We didn't highlight or box anything on this slide, pretty much because all of the information is important and relevant. So the sponsor is expecting to see section A, an executive summary that cannot exceed 2 pages. And then section B, technical approach. And then the solicitation is describing what this section needs to look like. The technical approach, as it calls out, is basically the centerpiece of the proposal. So that's really the project description that we're used to seeing. And then the executive summary is typically what we would call the abstract or the proposal summary.
All right, so we're still in volume 1, section 2, technology transition and national security impact. So this is another section. It says exactly how long it is, but just reading that, if you've never seen something like that before, it might be a little intimidating. But again, if you read right through it, it'll describe exactly what should be included in this technology transition and national security impact section. So again, we didn't highlight anything specific, but this is a section where you could literally bring up one document on one side of your screen and bring up this guidance on the other part of your screen and compare, is this addressing what the FOA is asking for this section? So this is a pretty good example of one of those non-standard proposal documents.
All right, stay with us. We're still with volume 1, the technical and management proposal, section 2. Just moving on, we've done A, B, C. Now D, they're expecting to see a statement of work. We really wanted to highlight here that the statement of work must not include proprietary information. So this is really important for the PI to know. The PA, the proposal analyst, is not going to know what's proprietary information or not. That's going to have to come from the PI, but that's a really important thing to call out here, so the PI is aware to not include any proprietary information in this section. And then we see section E, schedules and measurable milestones. So DARPA is expecting to see a table of program milestones and completion dates.
All right. Ali had mentioned the risk analysis and mitigation plan. Again, it details pretty specifically what they're expecting to see in that. And it's also worth noting, Ali had kind of mentioned that some of these documents might sound different or have different titles than what you're used to, but this G, the teaming and facilities document, if you read it through, it sounds a lot like a facilities and other resources document from NSF. Same thing with H, the ongoing research and proposer accomplishments. Sounds like kind of a combination of a biosketch and a current and pending. So while a lot of these documents might sound a little odd or a little new, a lot of it contains a lot of the same information that we've seen before.
All right, we're finally on to volume 2, the cost proposal, section 1. So we're finally moving out of volume 1, that technical and management portion, and moving into the cost proposal, which is just as important, just very different because obviously it's relating to the budget. So the first thing, section 1, again, we're expected to include a cover sheet. We really want to point out that this is not the same cover sheet as the one completed for volume 1. At first it looks the same, but after taking a deeper look at it, you can see that there are different requirements. So like Travis mentioned, we love seeing stuff like this because it's basically a checklist and it's very easy for proposal analysts to double check that the PI has included the information that is expected by the sponsor.
So this is the same cover sheet continued, so clearly you can see that it's already longer than the previous cover sheet. We wanted to include this section for that bold language, and especially when they underline bold language. The cost volume proposer checklist must be included with the cover sheet of the cost proposal. Now, unfortunately, when you search the rest of the FOA, the cost volume proposer checklist isn't necessarily laid out. So there are some times when you have to go to Google or to the sponsor's website to find out what some of these specific documents that they reference are. We see that a lot with the tax representations and liabilities documents, lobbying disclosures, those sorts of things. So be prepared to do a little bit of extra searching sometimes.
And moving on, we're still in volume 2 cost proposal, and now we've moved on to section 2. This is where DARPA is expecting to see detailed cost information for the prime and any subawards or subcontractors. So here is where we're starting to see a little bit more information regarding budget guidelines, which again, we had a whole slide on that and kind of what we want to call out and look for in those sections. So what we have highlighted here is that we are expected to provide a detailed cost breakdown by phase, technical task, subtask, and month. So these are, whenever a PA sees this, it's a bit of a bummer because it's a lot of additional requirements on us. So we're going to have to break out the proposal or the budget by phase, task, subtask. That information needs to come from the PI. We're not aware of what the different tasks are, and then by month. So again, this is a great example of something that would take us much more time than a standard proposal submission. And then further on, it's simply, DARPA is just breaking out costs by major cost items. Those should look very familiar to you. They're just like our cost estimation tool here at OCG.
All right, again, we've talked about recognizing deviations, not just from standard practice, but from what we see in a lot of other proposals. So this section E, subparagraph I, for IT and equipment purchases include a letter stating why the proposer cannot provide the requested resources from its own funding. Often we'll see, requests for computer or laptop or computing resources. This one is specifically saying that we need to justify why the proposer cannot provide those resources already. A little bit further down, the price bill of material and the basis of estimate. This is worth noting as well because any item that exceeds $2,000, which, as we know from most internal cost estimations, there's a lot of items that could qualify, must be supported with some documentation. We see this a lot with DoD as well as DOE. Copy of catalog price lists, vendor quotes. This could be screenshots of Travelocity when we're doing travel, GSA rates, GRA rates, all that kind of stuff. A lot of this stuff the PA can and will help with as well.
And moving on with the cost proposal, we're still just taking a look at all of those standard categories that we would see in our cost estimation tool. DARPA is calling out what information they expect to see if consultants are included, and same with subcontracts. I'm not going to go through all those details, but pretty much the entire slide and all of the text is relevant.
All right, this element is not saying that cost sharing is required, but the amount of any industry cost sharing needs to be broken out. Again, OCG's general recommendation is if cost sharing is not required, we should not be moving forward with.
And then last, after we've gone through volume 1 and volume 2, we come to submission information. This is very important as well because it's telling us when we are expected to submit and how we are expected to submit. So we're expected to submit at darpa.mil. And we see deadlines here. There's a deadline that's separate for the abstract due date and then for the full proposal due date. And again, you see bolded and underlined at the last possible text there, proposals received after this deadline will not be reviewed. So just another great example of this is the official deadline and we have to meet that or else we will not be able to submit the proposal.
All right, so hopefully we've given you some tools at least to start tackling some of these more complex FOAs. One of the things we hope everyone takes away is that some of these requirements may necessitate advanced planning. Anything involving cost share or IDC addendums, extra level approvals, and even just that task month budget breakdown that Allie's referenced a couple of times is going to physically take some time to get through. We do have a lot of checklists. NSF, NIH, NASA, we have a lot of resources that OCG hopefully is communicating out to everybody. If anyone has any questions, let us know. And as we work more with some of these sponsors, we're trying to generate more resources and more tools that'll help simplify the process. And then finally, as always, feel free to contact your department's OCG proposal analyst. If you have any questions about how to do that, we can help guide you in the right direction. Whew, all right.
Wonderful. You guys made it through with us, which we very much appreciate, as this was a bit of a scramble, just learning how to Zoom from home. Yeah, we're working in crazy times right now. So we really appreciate everyone for attending and bearing with us. And Travis and I are happy to stay online for a bit. We'll keep this open. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to ask them on the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask if you want to talk to us in person. We also have our emails listed here too, and we're happy to answer other questions you may have. I know Nikki will send out a follow-up email with a survey and hopefully all of the other attachments that we talked about if you want to if you want to work through some of those. But we thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully we get to meet some of you in person at some point. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.